Hey guys, it's m.terk here again. We're going to be getting into another tutorial today. Today we're going to be doing one on a high gauge fused Clapton. The fused Clapton concept was originated by a guy on Instagram, goes by the name of Squid Dude. It's an awesome concept. It's fairly easy to wrap. We're going to be doing it today with 50 gauge twisted messes wire over top of two 26 gauge anarchist cores. Let me give you a little run through of the tools we're going to be using and then we'll get right into it. Again, flush cut clippers, possibly nylon jaw pliers, a couple different kinds of toothless pliers, some drivers, ceramic tip tweezers, the jig kit that I like to use. It's made by Ude. It's a pack. It has like 6 different slugs in it. Comes in a little nice black case. Made by UD. If you look it up, you could find it that way. Squeeze clamp to hold my swivel down to the table. Since it's high gauge wire, I'm going to be using 3 ball bearing swivels hooked in line with these snap hooks. This way it keeps the cores from twisting. Going to be building it on one of these new 1.5 version Petries Addies. Putting that on top of the Petrie dot mod tube. The wire we're going to be using today is Anarchist. You can get this from Local Vape. The high gauge wrap wire that I'm going to be using is 50 gauge Nichrome 80 from Twisted Messes. You can get that from twistedmesses.com. And when I'm wrapping high gauge wire, I like to use a very fast drill. It just wraps a little bit more consistent. So the one I'm using today is a 3000 RPM corded drill. All right, let's switch back to the full screen and we're going to get into the build. All right, so step 1, we're going to take our 26 gauge AN80 and we're going to straighten out about a 1 foot to 2 foot piece. Again, I like to straighten it by stretching it a little bit. So I grab both ends with the toothless pliers and just pull on it very, very lightly. That pulls it perfectly straight without having to twist it. I'm going to fold that in half. I mean, you could use this method for fusing pretty much any style of wrapping. You could use this on a swivel like this. So I'm going to bend a 90-degree leg in both sides, and we're going to put that into the drill. It's very important for this to be perfectly centered in the drill so that it doesn't wobble when you're trying to wrap this high gauge wire. So you're just going to test spin it a couple times to make sure that it doesn't have too much wobble in the chuck. It's spinning pretty straight. So the next step, we're going to take our 50 gauge Twisted Messes wire and the ceramic tip tweezers, and we're going to wrap it as many times as we can around 1 or 2 of these legs to kind of like help lock it in place. And we're going to start our wrap a couple times because that'll also help lock it in place with this real thin wire. Now, I like to hold the spool in my hand, but you can't put too much pressure on this wire, otherwise you will break it because it is very delicate. So you got to make sure your hands are nice and clean so that the spool doesn't bind on your skin, on the oils in your skin. And then we're going to start wrapping. I'm going to zoom in so you can see a little bit closer how I'm wrapping, but I just want you to see how I'm holding the spool in my hand because that's probably the most important part to this. So let me fuse up a little bit and then we're going to stop and I'll switch to a closer view. Another very important key part to this is when you're holding the spool, you can somewhat see the wrap wire. You know, if you're using 36 or 38 or something like that, you can see it a little bit better than this gauge. I just want to show you that it is possible all the way up to 50 gauge. But you're pretty much just looking at the wire. As you're wrapping, you're going to see the cores getting darker from the wrap wire as you're going. And you could somewhat catch the glisten of the 50 gauge with good lighting. And as long as you're holding your wrap wire 90 degrees or slightly less on a back angle towards the drill, it tends to wrap pretty tightly. If you're holding it a little bit past 90 degrees or advanced, it's going to gap your wraps. So let me zoom in, and then we're going to continue fusing. Okay, so I put a piece of white paper down on the table just so you could hopefully see the wire getting darker as I'm wrapping. So I'm going to start fusing this up. Alright, so here's a progress shot, and then we're going to finish fusing it up. So I got lucky and I made it to the end and it just broke. So I'm going to switch back to a larger view and probably over the top so you can see how I coil it up. Alright, so now that we have our wire wrapped up and it's off the drill and the swivel, we're going to coil it up now. I'm using a little coil jig here that I like to use. I'm going to be using a 2.5 tip. We're going to bend a little 90 degree in the end of the line here. Now you got to be very delicate with this wire because if you run your hands across the wraps, you will open them all up. I mean, if you're working with 36 gauge or 34 gauge or something that's a little bit thicker, it's not as bad. But when you're working with 50 gauge like this, you really can't touch the wraps at all. So once I got it on the jig here, I'm just going to roll it up very slowly, because if you try to go too quick, you're going to bust the wraps off the outside of the wire. So we're going to do 6 wrap. And we're going to cut it off. Now, I don't even like to touch the coils even after they're coiled up. I use these little slugs to also load them in the deck. So we're going to wrap up our second coil. It's very important to inspect these coils before you put them in now if you are using 50 gauge or 46 or something very thin. If you don't inspect them to make sure that the wraps are all tight, they could potentially come apart while you're vaping them, and you don't want to be vaping on metal. I got enough for 2 more coils here. I'll save that for later. Just going to straighten out this little 90. And I'm going to bend the legs on these. I like to bend both of them so that they are flat when they go into the deck. Alright, so now that we have our 2 coils, we're going to take our RDA, put it onto our tube or box or whatever you're working off of. And we're going to take our slug that we used to wrap the coils on. That's what we're going to use to handle these as we set them in the deck. Now again, you can't really touch the wraps with these with your fingers because you will loosen them up and make them either look ugly or just gappy or possibly break the wraps on them. So you got to be very gentle with them. As well as when you're pinching them. Pulsing them doesn't matter, they do not melt. I've had them pretty cherry hot and they do not melt the wire, even though it is very thin. Turns some pretty cool colors, but it doesn't melt. Now, this is probably the hardest part of the whole process, is actually loading them without breaking them or damaging them. Alright, so once you got them pretty much in the deck, we're going to pulse them up. I'm going to switch to a macro shot of what the coils should look like where they stand now before I fire them up, and then we'll come back and we'll pulse and pinch them. Alright, so now it's time to pulse this up. Just going to pulse it slowly. Alright, so we got them glowing pretty evenly. Final torque down our screws. Now it's time to wick them up. We're going to wick them up with some Japanese cotton. I'm gonna wet it up. Dripping butterscotch from Black Label. Big surprise. Vapor production's pretty good on these coils. The fact that you use thinner wrap wire like that just makes it so it heats up much easier than, say, 36 gauge or, you know, 32 gauge or whatever most people are using. I just like to go thin. My personal favorite is like 42 gauge, 44. You don't have to do 50 gauge. It's just kind of, you know, to get it smaller so it fits into the post holes a little bit better, which is the other major advantage of using a much thinner wrap wire. So it fits just about anything. Alright, so now that we got our build all loaded up, I'll show you a little vapor production off of it. For a single 18650 cell, it works pretty good. It's a 6 wrap on a 2.5 millimeter, 50 gauge twisted message wire over top of 226 gauge AN80 cores. That's all I got for you guys today. Next, I think I'm going to try to get into one of those like low pro Claptons. I got to order some ribbon wire. So as soon as that comes in, I'm going to do another tutorial on that. Thank you again for watching. Comment down below any more suggestions that you guys have or any other tutorials that you would like to see. Check out vvvapes.com if you guys would like to order some pretty cool builds. We got alien builds up there, the frame builds, the cat tracks, and the fused Claptons. We also got a lot of juice up online too, so thank you for watching and see you next time.